Welcome in, Panthers Nation. Today we are here with part two of our series where we are evaluating the first year of Dan Morgan as the general manager of the Carolina Panthers. Today we're focused on draft picks with the caveat that we're also going to look at two undrafted free agents in this mix as well. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the Carolina Panthers first draft. So in the episode before this, if you haven't seen it, we evaluated the trades. So today we're not going to talk about the trades. Today we are going to solely focus on the draft picks. And again, like I said, the two undrafted free agents. We'll also create a third and final video to evaluate the free agency signings. So we're going to do a full picture of Dan Morgan. Kicking us off, first pick in the draft for the Carolina Panthers at pick number 32, Xavier Legette. And I know there's a lot of mixed opinions about Legette. A lot of people who think it was a reach, a lot of people who think he's a bust, a lot of people who were not satisfied with the production. But we're very early in the process, and I don't think he's the same thing as Jonathan Mingo. I am a little bit biased as I did like Xavier Legette coming out. You guys know that. And he is the pick that I wanted the Panthers to take. I didn't expect them to trade up to get him, although it was only one spot. But I see it from both sides. I mean, you go back the first few weeks of the year, the hype was real. The production, the touchdowns, the celebrations, the accent, all those things, and everything was running smoothly for the Carolina Panthers. Then the drops started to happen, the injuries, and I don't know how much any of this played into his overall production this year, but you have to feel like a little bit. I mean, we'll get news if he ends up having to have surgery later. I don't know. I don't know if it was that significant or not, but it seemed like things just compounded. And he even made comments during the season about reaching out to Bryce Young, telling him he was going to make up for it. And unfortunately, he did not make up for it. But let's talk about his stat line. He had 49 receptions. He did leave the Carolina Panthers in receptions. Adam Thielen right below him at 48, and Adam Thielen played in 6 less games. Thielen also had more receiving yards. He's a beast. But 497 yards on the year, better than Mingo's season. Not to mention Mingo never got in the end zone. He finished with 4 touchdowns and about 10.1 yards per catch. When we evaluate this, we are going to stick right down the middle of the evaluation. I think it made sense. But you also have to look at Ladd McConkey. I've made the video, talked about the comparison, and or a few other wide receivers that were in that mix and the potential for the Carolina Panthers to draft. So for now, we will give this a solid C, maybe teetering on C+, but I think there's a lot of potential. Hey, as we give out grades, there's a chance to go back, make edits, resubmit. And so there's a lot of time left for Dan Morgan to get this pick right. We move on to the second selection in the draft for the Panthers, which was pick number 46, and that was Texas running back Jonathan Brooks. Unfortunately, it was a tough year. He finished with 9 carries for a total of 22 yards, 2.4 yards per carry. In the passing game, he ended up with 3 receptions for a grand total of 23 yards. It was a very short-lived debut. It gets pushed out. He gets activated. I mean, this whole thing, and I talked a little bit about it in the trade video and when we evaluated the trades for him to go back up and get. When you sit back and look at this situation, it's tough, man. On paper, he was the best running back in the draft, but then you see players like Bucky Irving, you see later round picks hit, and the Carolina Panthers are stuck now with essentially a wasted pick. Now, I'm not saying his talent is wasted, and I'm not saying he won't produce in 2 years, but you're really talking about a 2-year gap of a second round pick. You can't do that. And you even go back to last year with Jonathan Mingo. You can't have your second round selections not producing, not on the team, not on the field. Those guys, they don't have to be all-stars. They don't have to be Pro Bowlers or all pros, but they at least need to be starters or they need to be getting valuable reps. And so it's unfortunate. Now, that's not to say year 3, because he's not going to play next year, Jonathan Brooks. Year 3, maybe hopefully a better story. But, the NFL, it moves fast, it comes by. I hope he's able to recover, but it's tough. I mean, considering the ups and downs of the trade, it's so hard to look at these kind of looking at as it was versus now. I would teeter on the side of maybe a C minus or a D. And again, it's a similar situation to Xavier Legette. Now, it's not in Jonathan Brooks's control or Dan Morgan's or Dave Canales' that he got injured coming back. I think they took the precautions, although the trainer gets fired, but I do think they took the precautionary measures to get him ready to play. And they even had him wait an extra game when he was available or could have been available when they traveled to Germany. It just stinks, man. And it's like non-contact injuries for the Panthers. It just seems to be a thing. So it is going to teeter on the side of that only because, like I said, he's not on the field and it's not really him, but he's not available to play. He's a second round pick and you really need to see some production. I hope in 2 years we're looking back and this is a home run. He hasn't had a chance to get his legs underneath him. So it's very hard to evaluate. But for now, I mean, at the time, probably a B, but as we get in the post evaluation process, probably closer to a D. Not the player themselves, again, the situation. All right, we have our third selection in the draft out of the third round, pick number 72 in Trevin Wallace. I know a lot of folks in Carolina were hoping that we would get Peyton Wilson. I was too, but then there was some post-draft news that came out about his injuries. It is what it is. Either way, Trevin Wallace gets shoved into the equation a little bit earlier than we would have anticipated because of the injury to Shaq Thompson, and he has to step up very early. Lots of rookie mistakes. By far, not a perfect season by any shot of the imagination. But you know what? He did come around. He finished with a total of 64 combined tackles, 36 solo, 28 assists, 2 tackles for loss, and 1 sack. Panthers need linebackers. I still wouldn't be surprised if they attack the free agency market. I don't know that Shaq Thompson comes back. I think Josie Jewell's a solid starter, but I wouldn't be surprised if they try to get someone else and then make Trevin Wallace a rotational piece. That being said, I mean, just evaluating him getting thrown into the fire, it was clear the Panthers were going to try to ease him into this situation, but then they couldn't. And so you just had to go out there and he had to learn. And so I'm hoping that learning translate into more production or a better year two for Trevin, whether he is a starter or not. Still a lot to be desired. Like I wasn't blown away by him, but again, he's a third round selection. Panthers need to hit on these picks. Plain and simple. They have to hit on these guys. I sit on this one, I'll give it a C plus. And I know I'm being a very hard grader as we go through this exercise, but I do want to be realistic with like just what I saw, what I felt. I know a lot of people thought he was fantastic. I did watch a lot of the film on Trevin. There were a lot of times he was biting in the backfield, keeping his eyes in the backfield, missing assignments, having to make up for it. So I do think he can come around to being a solid starter would be the ideal situation for Trevin Wallace. Then we have the fourth round selection and the fourth round pick number 101, Jatavian Sanders. And right out of the gate, before we even get too far into evaluating and throwing out stats, maybe the best pick of the draft. I'm going to say a B plus. And we'll explain it here in a second. Jatavian Sanders finished with 33 receptions, 342 yards, most receiving yards by Panthers tight end in probably the last 4 or 5 years, probably since Olsen, to be honest, because we haven't seen a lot out of the tight end. Tommy Tremble, Ian Thomas not hitting it. More yards than Tommy Tremble and Ian Thomas combined. You saw the glimpses of it. One, it took him a little bit longer to get going. I know he's got some work to do blocking, but once he came around and kind of got thrown into the fire again because of injuries with Ian Thomas and Tommy Tremble, we got to see the pass catching abilities. And I think the injury slowed things down, whether it was him, whether it was Canales, I don't know. Play calling, The ball was not getting to him late in the season after he came back from the injury. I'm hoping next year we see him come back, one, a little bit better on the blocking side. Not that he did terrible, but, coming around and maybe hitting that 500-yard mark. But yeah, 342 yards, 10.4 yards per target reception, and 1 touchdown. He appeared in 16 games. We then moved to nickel cornerback, Shaw Smith-Wade, 5th-rounder, pick number 157. He's someone that took a little bit longer to get revved up, primarily because had some guys in front of him, a lot of depth at that position, so he wasn't really going to get in the field or on the field over Mike Jackson at all. I mean, it's like just not going to happen when you talk about the number 2 spot. Once we saw Shaw Smith-Wade get into the lineup, I was impressed. Sure, it's going to take a little bit of time, but I do think he is a building block piece that the Carolina Panthers can lean on at the nickelback position heading into the future. I'd like to see him get more involved, but I do think it's a great spot for him, and that was primarily the reason the Panthers drafted him where they did, as I saw him work out at the nickelback position. I believe it was at the Senior Bowl. But for this, let's, 5th-round pick, he gets on the field, starts to kind of come around. So I think for me, it's got to be, honestly, this late and seeing production, a B-. So a lot of room for improvement, but you can see the grades kind of fluctuate a little bit as, you get a player that's drafted later that's having an impact or at least getting on the field. The last pick for the Carolina Panthers, because, well, I guess we can talk about the actual last pick that was traded, but for now, Jaden Crumedy, 6th-rounder, pick number 200. Unfortunately, he's another one that battled a lot of injuries. I don't know that there's enough here to really evaluate him as a player. I think we'll learn a lot about him heading into this offseason. I don't think there's a lot of expectations for a 6th-round pick. We need help on the defensive front and at the tackle position, so I'm hoping he can get into the rotation, get settled into this system, and start seeing the field. So for now, I mean, I don't have expectations, like I said, for a 6th-rounder. So for me, solid C, and we'll see. Maybe a C- where everything lands. You then have the last pick in 7th-rounder, Michael Barrett, who's traded away. There's nothing to evaluate. I will say, because of the trade, maybe you give this one A, only because it turned into Mike Jackson through everything that happened. So maybe it turns into an A or A+ for you, but likely sitting in the middle of, a C. There's just really nothing that we can evaluate with him. The last 2 guys that we'll talk about, of course, undrafted free agents that had an impact. These guys were hits. Of course, we'll start with the biggest one of them all, which is Jalen Coker. I don't think anyone could have expected the production that he had. I know there's a lot of people that had big expectations or high on him coming into this year. Steve Smith, a lot of folks in the Panthers community talked about him. You don't typically see undrafted free agents that are around that turn into hits. But hey, you've had an Adam Thielen, you've had a Coker, so take it for what you can get. He appeared in 11 games, so he had a slower start. It took a while for him to get up on the active roster. He made the roster, then he gets cut, then he gets signed to the practice squad, and luckily the Panthers could keep him, and they were able to develop him out. But he finished with 32 receptions, 478 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He had the 183-yard touchdown that was nice. He was close, very close to passing Xavier Legette in 5 less games. And I put out a stat that he ended up finishing with more so 35 wide receivers were drafted in this past year's draft class. He had more receiving yards than all but 9 of them. So I think the future is bright. I still think the Panthers need a number 1, but I also wouldn't be surprised if Coker is able to make a big push for the number 2 wide receiver. Now, I know a lot of his success is in the slot, but hey, see what he can do out wide. Having a rotation or I guess if Adam Thielen eventually retires, which, he's not going to play forever, you have a good option there. This is an A+. You hit on undrafted free agents, and especially ones that produce like this. You have to feel good about that. You want to continue to do that. And you want to start to actually hit on guys that you draft, especially 2nd-round picks. The last one that we'll evaluate is Damani Richardson. He finished with 51 tackles, 23 assists, and 28 solo, one tackle for loss, two pass deflections, and one interception. Like, safety room was one of the worst on the team. There's a lot of free agents. There's going to be a lot of turnover there. Damani Richardson was one of the bright spots. We saw him in the preseason. A lot of people wanted him to make the roster. They also wanted him to start. Took a little while to get there, but because of injuries and just lack of production by some of the guys out there, we eventually saw him get on the field late in the season and make a pretty good impact. And so I don't think he's a rotational piece. I don't know if he's a starter. I'd love for him to be a starter next year. But this is another one where I give it at least a B plus, if not an A minus, because you have to find guys like this. That's how you build out your teams and you're successful in the NFL. Well, folks, that's going to do it. That's your full evaluation of the draft class. If I had to give the whole draft class an overall grade right now, I know I was on the lower end, so I'm going to curve it a little bit. I think it's a B. I think the entire class is a B. I know it's a little bit harder on some players than others, but evaluating the whole class itself compared to some of the past draft classes for the Carolina Panthers, seems like this puts the Panthers in a good situation to succeed. So anyways, folks, we'll be back with one final episode on Dan Morgan, where we break down all of his free agent signings, and then we'll start to turn our attention to more of the offseason news for the Carolina Panthers. As always, this is Carolina Dad. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Y'all have a good one.